As far as I know, I'm unmuted.
I can hear him. I can hear him.
Yeah. So yeah. Can you hear me now, Farah?
Okay, we still can't hear you. Maybe
I
let me
can
see
hear
if
him.
I can
I
unmute
can
you.
hear him.
I can hear him.
Mm-hmm. Let's make sure Farah also hears me.
I'm sorry, that was actually probably my fault. Yeah, inshallah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Good, alhamdulillah. I'll just start over. So, Assalamu alaikum, bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm Arnold. I'm a PhD fellow and lecturer at Leiden University and at the Islamic University of Applied Sciences in Rotterdam. My own specialization is Islamic thought, intellectual history, and philosophy of religions and worldviews. And this is also the different forms of courses I teach at both institutions. And I maybe publish, when it comes to my academic writing, also on this intersection between philosophy of religion and intellectual history, as it is played out within in Kalam, Islamic theology, and different forms of hermeneutical discourses like tafsir.
So can we move on to Dr. Shoaib now? Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So my name is Shoaib. I'm currently in Dubai. I was an assistant professor of the natural sciences at Zayed University. My first PhD was in chemical engineering, and I'm just about to finish my second one in theology. And I mostly focus on areas pertaining to Islam and science, be they discussions related to evolution, extraterrestrials, quantum mechanics, and various other topics. And it's a pleasure to be talking with all of you today.
Okay, assalamu alaikum everybody. So I'm Farah Ahmed, and I'm a research fellow at the University of Cambridge in the Faculty of Education. So I'm bringing the pedagogical dimension to this, the education side of it. I am a founder, and I've worked in schools from early years all the way to secondary for coming up to 30 years, mashallah. And I've been engaged in educational research for over 10 years now, inshallah. So looking forward to having this conversation. I have actually put the questions that we're going to be, that are broadly going to frame our dialogue into the chat so that you can have a look at what we've been thinking about. And we're going to begin with the first one, which has actually been covered quite a lot in the presentations in this conference. So perhaps we're going to sort of go through this a bit quicker and go on to the second question for more depth. But the first question is, to what extent is our knowledge, our understanding of ilm, knowledge, and being what exists key to how we think about Islam, science, and education in Muslim contexts? So I'll put it to Arnold first, and it'd be lovely to hear your thoughts on that, inshallah.
So first of all, of course, the idea of knowledge itself cannot be detached from the idea of being itself. And we first work out, of course, what is being is, first of all, what is being human. So that's also aligned with the second question about human nature. So any question about knowledge is anthropological. Technically, it starts as an anthropological question before it becomes a theological question or a natural science question itself. It already starts with simply what it means to be human. And so the idea of nature, for example, is first of all already starts with what's then the idea of human nature. So what is a human as a physical being, a biological being, the idea of being a physical entity, and thereby also the different elements, what makes us, in a sense, similar towards a rock. What do we share the physicality of a rock? And in what way do we share, for example, the biological concepts, like with what we share with animals, plants, etc. And then, of course, what sets us apart. This has always been the main focus of in a sense, any larger worldview that that in the end always corresponds not simply to what is the divine, what is the transcendent, or not, or rejecting the idea of the divine or any form of transcendent, but always begins and ends up with sort of a circular motion in what is the human. And so the idea of knowledge itself then, of course, has to do with how do you define it? Is knowledge, does it have an end goal? Or is it simply something we can do? So is it simply capability, or is it also an obligation? So is it a capability with an obligation attached to it. This is not simply something we can do, but also something that we need to do. From, for example, a secular perspective, in the secular metaphysics, the idea, of course, that in the secular metaphysics, the world itself doesn't have an end purpose. There's no telos, there's no end game towards existence. It's simply there. And also even the time itself is open-ended. So there's no end point towards time. So humans are only an event, an occurrence within being, within existence. And therefore knowledge is simply has a functional aspect, like we have the capability to gain knowledge, and we can use it to extend our well-being and to have certain type of influence in the world, and then people can live their lives in the best way possible, and that's it. So knowledge itself only has an in the world function from a secular perspective, only an in the world function, and it doesn't have any end game beyond human lives themselves. So one of the main problems in that perspective, from which has been critiqued by many other worldviews, but also within the secular worldview itself, is that a large part of the secular worldview is completely anthropocentric, is only focused on, well, how does things serve the human, because there's no meaning to life except what humans make it to be. And therefore, everything is human-centered, human-focused, and has a functionality towards humans. But for example, when it comes to Islam, as a theistic worldview, then of course the human is not simply an occurrence, a possibility within existence. It is a possibility that was desired by a higher being. And every existence is an extension of the will of the higher being, which we call Allah. And therefore, from that perspective, knowledge suddenly is not simply capability of the human, but also has an objective. It has an end game. It has a goal it's working towards. It has a maqsid. It has a stationary, different stationaries and degrees it can work towards. So knowledge has different concepts within different worldviews. So therefore knowledge within, for example, in a public school, where technically a sort of neutrality is applied, and therefore taking the secular as the neutral version, which of course it's not. It's not a neutral worldviews don't exist. Therefore, knowledge within public schools sort of lose this end game perspective and reduce it to an in the world concept. While from within a Christian worldview and an Islamic worldview, knowledge itself has a larger purpose beyond the human. So it's not simply only anthropocentric. And therefore also human nature, the idea that either human nature is simply an event, an occurrence, thereby it reduces, in the secular worldview, the human is simply a possibility that arose in time and will also probably disappear in time. And so humans don't have a larger meaning within existence. So grab what you can, gain what you can, and then, when the time is done for you as an individual or humanity in general, then time's up. But from a theistic perspective, Islam is what we call a form of radical theism, the idea that we emphasize the radical uniqueness of the divine being. Within an Islamic worldview, the human is a willed event. It is an occurrence that has on purpose been placed within existence, and that existence in total has a larger purpose. So within the Islamic worldview, it's not about you anymore. So human nature is willed, and also it has a purpose within it that is simply not self-serving, as in a large perspective, the secular worldview makes human nature very small, has no meaning, but at the same time, it creates its own meaning. So you get the circular argumentation that human nature is self-serving. In a theistic worldview, it's not. It is not self-serving. It is serving the absolute other, God, Allah, and it's also serving the rest of creation, whereby a human puts itself you know, in the last place. It serves, you know, the creator and creation, and before it serves itself. So therefore also knowledge and the purpose of knowledge has a very different structure and a different methodology, different purpose within those different worldviews.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for that. I mean, what I was hearing from that, which is, I think, really important for us to think about as educators, is that if we move away from this individualistic and materialistic approach towards knowledge and the human being, and we open our ideas to this notion of fitra as human nature, which is something which is divinely ordained, and think about that from our perspective as Muslims, actually the human being has been given certain ways of understanding the world, which are by their very nature allow the reception. There's a receptivity to that they allow the reception of knowledge from Allah. So the aqliya, the hissiyah, so our cognitive abilities, our senses, and then our qalb as well, our heart, our openness to that. If we begin from that perspective, that as educators, that this is something that Allah has put uniquely within human beings in the rest of creation that we can observe. We'll leave the question of extraterrestrial life to Dr. Shoaib in a little while, but within in terms of what we can observe as human beings, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that in the Quran, that Adam alayhi salam was taught the names of things, that we have the capacity to know in a different kind of way to animals and plants, as you just mentioned. So there is, in this sense, a communal and dialogic and relational nature to knowledge and how we understand knowledge and how we understand the human being and our relation, which really creates a paradigm shift in how we think about education, because it moves the education from getting some knowledge into this one individual into a space where we're now thinking about education as the natural process of being in a relational way, both in terms of our relations with what's around us and how we know the objects that are around us, the things, the shay that are around us, and how we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and also how we know ourselves. So this is something that I think will help us think as science educators. I'm going to pass on to Dr. Shoaib now. What are your thoughts as a scientist on what Arnold and I have been saying?
So I think there are two very distinctive approaches here that have some overlap. Theologically, we know that there's God and then everything other than God, and everything other than God includes all of creation. These are things that that we can see in nature, the world around us, as well as things that we cannot see, jinns and angels, heaven and hell. So that's the fundamental ontology of existence. But when it comes to knowing, we can reason about things like God, but we're also informed about things through revelation, right? Things like angels, heaven, prophets of the past. Otherwise, we wouldn't know about them unless God informed us about them, because they're embedded in our history or because they're embedded in a space which we can't access. Science is very different. Science is more of a bottom-up approach. You use and you mostly instrumentalize the five senses and your logical basis, which is something that you can also use in the theological sciences, but it lacks one key ingredient, and that is revelation, testimony of sorts. And that's one of the main areas in which I think science has stumbling blocks when it comes to becoming an encompassing worldview. I think Osama mentioned in his presentation, when science, which is fundamentally a methodology or a set of methodologies, so what a biologist does is not the same thing as a physicist, but a physicist does not the same thing as an engineer. All these things, what they're trying to do is understand the natural world. And fundamentally, their job is to explain the world on natural terms. That is a job. When I get paid as a scientist or to teach about science, I want to know how X, Y, Z things work. And as a result of that, when me or the atheist scholar, when we're doing the electron microscope, when we're doing acid base, methodologically, we're doing the exact same thing. Where we differ, however, is our worldview perspective, which is where Arnold's expertise comes in. And that is to do largely with how we understand where did all this come from. Science takes things like the world is there, the world is intelligible as a given, Theology gives it the proper foundations. Well, this comes from a being that put laws in nature, and he did it for a purpose. Whereas on atheistic terms, it's just a freak of nature, it's an accident, and it's just created out of nowhere. And I think that's where we need to be able to appreciate the difference between science as a methodology versus scientism, which is, science as a methodology versus scientism, which is an ideology. And unfortunately, people like Richard Dawkins do a lot of damage when he proclaims that, you're either a religious person or a scientist. I think that's a false bifurcation. You can absolutely be a Muslim scientist and be very successful and fully understand and make the best attempts to understand the world. In fact, what prompted a lot of our earlier scholars was the fact that God created the world. People wanted to know what were the laws that he embellished in the world? And I think that was a very interesting source of motivation. So I think that these differences need to be made clear. As for how this trickles down into, teaching Islam and science, the first starting point, and this is where I really resonate a lot with Sheikh Hamza's model, is you teach them basic epistemology, right? How do we come to know things? And there are various things that come into this discussion. As I mentioned earlier, science mostly focuses on reason and the empirical aspects, whereas in Islamic thought, we actually look at the reason, senses, as well as revelation. It is a key ingredient in our source. And it's not just arbitrarily base our faith on this. It's for strong reasons that we believe in revelation. And I think once you start that epistemic framework, and you particularly double down into the contingency argument, which I think grounds the Islamic worldview very well, I think that clarifies a lot of these discussions within the Islam and science framework. So take just the question of quantum mechanics, for instance. Quantum mechanics is a very basic theory that says, on a very fundamental level, things are popping in and out of existence. There are famous atheists who say that, this means something can come out of nothing, which is false. Number one, scientifically, it's not coming out of nothing. It's actually coming out of a wave of sorts. And two, even if it were to come out of nothing, that doesn't actually entail that there is no creator. God can still make the world look a little bit fuzzy to us, such that we can't really fully grasp things. But that doesn't mean he doesn't exist. And I think that's where atheists try to drive a wedge between religion and science. And I think those are the starting points, at least the way I approach classrooms, and trying to help both the theological students as well as scientific students in terms of understanding the turf between science and Islamic thought.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, of course.
In a sense, to both what you're saying. First of all, I think it's important when it comes to human nature, in a lot of, let's say, in the way we now talk a lot in let's say Western Islamic theology, saying as in Islamic theology expressed mainly to English language means. A lot of times we now use the word fitra in a way that doesn't really align with how it was used in classical Islamic theology. So technically, for example,
I never used the word fitra. I didn't use the word fitra.
No, Farah.
Farah. Sorry. I didn't know who you were responding to.
But it's not a comment directly to Farah in a sense, but more in the general way that also one of the mismatches we still have now, which is also why, and that has to do with my comment in that sense, we still need to salvage so much from the tradition, from the Islamic pre-modern tradition, in the way how it is a discursive tradition. So for example, they would, a lot of times, and I'm specialized mainly in the Maturidi tradition, so let's reduce my main focus on the Maturidi side of Sunni theology, is they rather use the term khilqa, the idea of creation, whereby, for example, they would differentiate between the idea of tabbi, the idea of natural creation, the idea of physical creation, and then, for example, fitra as the idea of an element of human nature. But a lot of times we use fitra now in a form of tokenism as the Islamic version of human nature, while fitra technically was only an aspect of human nature. So this has a lot to do that because we sort of use now these sort of selective words, and we overemphasize them in a way that the tradition did not use them. That's also one of the things we need to be careful about when it comes to knowledge and how we teach knowledge and Islamic perspectives to our children, is that we also sometimes use words and overemphasize them in the Western Islamic theology, in our Western Islamic teachings, that we and thereby also creating these very because it mimics a lot of way how Christian theology uses these type of terms. So we use them as sort of, we Islamicize a lot of Christian discourse, and we Islamicize them through like these sort of tokenisms, oh fitra, and this and this and this. Well, technically the classical tradition has a very different structure in how it approaches nature, human nature, etc. So I think that's one of the things that also, one of the things we really need to do is really look at what the tradition, how it used terms. That's one thing I want to comment about. And the second one is a bit about adding things to what Shoaib was saying, is that yes, we're talking about the scientific method. Technically, the scientific method should not use Islamic epistemology, because Islamic epistemology informs the Islamic worldview, and the scientific method only discusses natural phenomena, which then can be used to inform, you know, the way we interpreted the Islamic worldview. So partially the idea that science needs revelation is no, the Islamic worldview needs revelation, because a method itself is of course, it's not neutral. It has the color of the person applying it. One of the main problems is that until now, a lot of the majority of people representing natural sciences were people with a secular worldview, or even when they're Christian, they mimic a secular worldview, or they present themselves in a secular worldview. So it is not that for example, that theism should be part of the scientific method, because it cannot be. Philosophically, it cannot be part of the scientific method. What it does is that simply you have the natural sciences and the scientific method. You know, a bacteria is a bacteria. You know, they're simply there. So what do you say about the bacteria? It has these elements, it has these characteristics that defines the genus bacteria. Okay, and then if you place it within a secular worldview, bacteria has this meaning. If you place it within an Islamic worldview, it has this meaning. So then the Islamic epistemology comes in, where revelation and tradition informs the larger Islamic worldview. So it's not that science misses revelation, the secular worldview misses revelation. And also, by the way, if you look at classical Islamic theology, a lot of other different worldviews did not accept revelation. That's the whole critique of Kalam against Buddhism, for example, and even Hinduism, that it technically doesn't apply the revelation concept as we know them. So science doesn't miss revelation. Science should simply be a scientific method. The question is, until now, science has been mainly claimed by one worldview. And I think that is the main thing that we need to focus on, is, like Shoaib just said, a Muslim can be a scientist. Yes, what we need is more people from different worldviews than simply the secular worldview representing natural science, and show the different possibilities how to use natural knowledge, which was always done in pre-modern times. How to use, for example, natural philosophy, which is also why all the Greek philosophy was translated into Arabic, and it became part of the Islamic worldview because it was used filtered through the Islamic epistemology, was filtered through it, thereby informing the Islamic worldview, and then showcased as in, and therefore the Islamic worldview is more robust in relation to natural and revealed sciences. So so in that kind of way, what we need is not the scientific method becoming theology. No, what we need is more representation of how natural sciences is represented, is applied as a scientific method by Muslims staying within the Islamic worldview. Because what happens now is that a lot of Muslim scientists, they're already out there. There's now one right in front of me, Shoaib Malik. You know, he's a Muslim scientist, but a lot of them think, and you see this also, by the way, with a lot of Christian natural scientists as well, is that they can only play the game if they act secular, if they act in, you know, in mimic secular ways. What we need is that when it comes to scientific publications, they simply stay within the scientific method, but they should also add, for example, you know, over time, publications how their scientific insights also informs their worldview. And I think one of the great examples of this is Francis, the head of the Human Genome Project. He's a Christian, a faithful Christian. And later in his life, he wrote books, but also a lot of interviews, how the Human Genome Project informed his Christian worldview, and thereby showing there was no, for him, you know, scientific knowledge created no mismatch in his worldview, but made it more robust.
So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Dr. Shoaib, we've only got a few minutes left, so I don't know if you want to say something really quickly, and then I want to try and get this back into the classroom and education.
Sure.
Yeah.
So actually, my point was about the classroom. So I completely agree that science is neutral. It can be couched in an atheistic worldview as well as a theistic perspective. There's no denying that whatsoever. And I definitely agree that science doesn't need revelation, but it needs the proper worldview to allow it to function in a consistent narrative, 100%. I can say, however, that in my experience with teaching science students for the past 10 years, most don't have that worldview. A lot of Muslim students are drifters in the sense that they don't even know what a worldview construction looks like. I'll share one anecdote with you. I was in a classroom where I had to teach students from multiple different bodies, Pakistani boards, Indian boards, British boards, American boards, and we were streamlining them for a European exam, Czech Republic, for medicine. And I was teaching them physics, chemistry, and biology. And I remember I asked, and these were Muslim students, by the way, right? So 90% were Muslim. I asked them, how many of you believe you are just your neurons? They're like, up here. Every hand went up. Every hand. And I was shocked, like this is a, you know, Muslim crowd. And so what I, from a bottom up level, if science is all they've been fed without, you know, worldview construction tools, then that's a problem. And I think exactly once that is diagnosed, the actual way of dealing with this is to give them an apparatus, a way of thinking about larger things. And that's where I think theology kicks in really well. That's all I wanted to add. And that works our way into the classroom as well.
Yeah, and thank you, by the way, Farah. I'll keep it very short. Exactly that point is, like I said, that's what I mean with this sort of mimicking the secular worldview, is that they're drifters. They become, and exactly that, they're stuck in this liminal space between because there's this assumption that the scientific method, you know, in a sense, only makes sense in a secular worldview. So what is lacking is how it informs the Islamic worldview in a robust way. And that is something that is missing. We need more literature and more engagement with, you know, how the scientific method, the scientific knowledge doesn't conflict with technically with outcomes of scientific method, but how it aligns with it. Because that exactly what was done in a very structured way in pre-modernity, in the pre-7th century worldviews of ilm al-kalam and falsafa and hikmah in Islamic philosophy and theology. So, I mean, and that is, in a sense, should be the function of kalam al-jadid, the idea of the renewal of Islamic theology, is to create coherence between scientific method and informing the Islamic worldview.
Okay, no, thank you so much. I think we've just begun to open up a dialogue which could have been a number of hours long. Just a few reflections before we wrap up. I think that like to take this back to the classroom in terms of like when we're talking about science, we're talking about kids at sort of secondary plus, and for me that's too late, right? So we need to start thinking about them earlier on. So if I'd like to give a bit more positive anecdote from the schools that I'm involved with at Shakhsiyah schools, because we have this open dialogue with the kids from an early age, we try and get them to construct an Islamic way of thinking. I'm not sure I want to use the term worldview, I'll come on to that in a minute. Then I can give one example is a conversation I had in a halaqah with 7 to 8 year olds. And we have a theme called time and space. We've been looking at astronomy, you'd be looking at certain things. They were preparing for an Islamic Inventions Fair that they're going to be doing. And then I said to them, I asked them a question. I said, did you know that some people think that if you're a religious person, you can't be a good scientist? And the response I had from these 7 to 8-year-olds was very different, because they were shocked. They were like, huh? How can that be? And you literally kids saying, that's wrong. And then when I was asking them why they think that's wrong, they were saying all the kinds of things that we've been saying for the past 2 days, that because Allah gave us the way to understand, that's what we're here for. Of course, we're going to be doing science because we need to understand the creation of Allah, all this kind of thing. And this was something that enabled them. The point I'm trying to make is that we're not only are we giving them the way of thinking as a Muslim, so how we understand the world and so on, but we're also from an early age in a very sophisticated kind of way. So not just throwing things at them, making them aware that their belief system is not the dominant belief system, and making them prepared to hear this kind of thing and not be shocked by it, but at the same time, still see it for what it is. And that's the kind of thing that we can do in the classroom. When I was talking about fitra, I wasn't using the term, perhaps you're absolutely right, Arnold, that it has a very much more, and I don't know enough about it, but I am aware that it's a much more limited kind of understanding than all the other aspects of insan, of the human being. And there is so much more there within our tradition of how we understand what the human being is. But the challenge I think that this conference is trying to address is, how do we bring together that interdisciplinarity? So if we are going to start defining these terms, and some of us are doing that kind of work, how do we get the theologians involved to try and help us, support us, but do it in a way that's accessible to educators? Because most educators will not know the context within which you're using these terms and how they work together. And in fact, this also takes us to context. Context is so important, because, for example, in the UK context right now, we can no longer use the word worldview, because there is an approach from religious education which is using the worldview to delegitimize religion in some kind of capacity, and that's come through and so on. So religious educators who were quite comfortable using that word before are now, so language and terminology needs to be really thought through contextually, and I think that that's one thing that I wanted to contribute to this to this conference. But I'm going to bring this to a close now, because we're into our final 10 minutes, and I'd like to invite our team